حي على الفلاح.
I mean, put yourself in these shoes. Maybe you live a few thousand years ago, and your neighbor, who's a nice guy, everybody knows him in the neighborhood, respected gentleman, good businessman, comes from a good family. He knocks on your door one day and he tells you that he's a messenger of God because an angel came to him the other night and revealed this message to him. And not only did he reveal his message to him, now he has to deliver it to the neighbor, to the family, to everybody in the society. And on top of this, not only do you have to believe what he's saying, you have to follow every one of his instructions, because they're actually not his instructions, they're God's instructions. And not following them will mean you will live a cursed life here and eternal doom in the hereafter. Now this is what your neighbor comes and tells you. What's your immediate response? I mean, the immediate response for any normal human being is either A, you're crazy, B, what did you have for dinner last night?
Yeah.
You know, maybe he's possessed. Nowadays we say he's psychologically disturbed. In the old days they said he's possessed.
Yeah.
Right? Or he's playing a trick. It can't be for real. So skepticism is the normal response to a tall claim like that. And this is all of the prophets. All of the prophets claim to be messengers of God that received revelation, that speak on behalf of the Lord of the worlds. So from the very beginning, what we have to understand, nowadays it's easy to accept a religion because you have millions of followers, right? All over the world, believing the same thing. But imagine you have to be the first one. And everybody around you, your entire society says, this man is crazy, don't listen to him. Which is the same of Jesus, Isa alayhi salam, and of Moses as it is of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is the first thing. Messengers put themselves in a very difficult position. Not by their own choice, because God gives them this responsibility. And we also know it is our creed as Muslims that messengers, prophets and messengers, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Noah, etc., these are the most intelligent people that ever lived on the face of the earth. That God picked the most noble and smart people to do his task. And these people, as smart as they are, they would have pretty well known that if I make this claim to be a messenger, that the response I'm going to get is in the negative for the most part. They're doing this with their family, with their neighbors, with their business partners, with their society, with the leaders of their communities, every single day for decades, sometimes centuries in the case of Nuh alayhi salam, right? It seems an impossible task. And in this impossible position, it is understandable that very, very few people believed. And whoever did believe was considered crazy. These are the fanatics. And at the end of the day, when it became so difficult for the messengers to deliver their message, one of the precedences, one of the great legacies of God, of Allah, is that He would support His messengers with a miracle. In some cases, the miracle would come early, in other cases it would come late, but it would come. It would come to support their message, to make them more believable. If you don't think this is from me, here's a sign. So for example, for Muslims, Jesus, Isa alayhi salam, speaks at the day of his birth, and he claims the innocence of his mother when he's a day old. This in itself is a miracle, proving the truth that he in fact is a messenger. The angel tells Mary in the Qur'an that he is going to teach Jesus. As a child, he will have knowledge of the Torah and the Injil, the Gospel, all together. So he won't have to go study it to have the knowledge of it, he'll be given the knowledge of it to begin with. Which is why he's going to be able to correct the rabbis who may have made alterations at that time to the Bible, and he'll be coming after them, you've changed the word of God, etc. So prophets were given remarkable miracles. Now if you study the history that is common to Muslims and Christians and Jews, you find miracles like a staff turning into a snake, or a water parting in the case of Moses, or a dead person coming back to life, or the blind being able to see, or a clay bird being blown into and it turns into a real bird. These are miracles of prophets that we all believe in. The thing of it is though, Muslims believe that the overwhelming miracle of Islam, of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is not something visual. It's this message, it's these words. And they're not even given in the form of a book or a tablet or anything, they're spoken word. The Qur'an in its original form is spoken word. This is a dramatic departure from all the miracles of the past. I mean, if you talk to someone of similar faith, a Christian Jewish tradition, if you think of miracles, they're something for the eyes to see for the most part, right? A blind person being able to see again, and a leper being cured, etc. But for now, this miracle is less for the eyes to see, but more for the ears to hear. So how can that be miraculous? This is the first question that comes to mind. The Muslim response to that is, number one, the reason for this miracle being an audible one is because it had to outlive the life of its messenger. We Muslims believe Muhammad is the final messenger, and this message has to be carried forward. Now, for a believing follower of Jesus, when he tells his child, I saw the dead person come back to life, I saw the blind being cured with my own eyes, that's a father narrating an eyewitness account. That child would narrate it to his next generation as a family tradition. But after a few generations, it's just a story. You could believe it, or you could say, I've heard this from my parents, I don't know, I didn't see it for myself, which is the skeptic attitude we have today. The final messenger was given a miracle that you can look into much after he's gone. Unlike the miracles of previous prophets. Just as a small example again, we believe that Noah, for example, Nuh alayhi salam, or actually let's take Salih. Salih is an Arab messenger. He was given a she-camel as a miracle that came out of a boulder. It wasn't born of another camel, it was born out of a boulder. Yeah. Now I could tell you that, but you don't have to believe me because you didn't see it happen, right? A skeptic could say, well, that sounds nice, but it's just another fairy tale. This is mythology, Islamic mythology. So we were given something in Islamic creed, in the intellectual tradition, one consistent subject for the last 1500 years in Islamic scholarship has been the subject called I'jazul Qur'an. What that literally means is the overpowering, miraculous power of the Qur'an. That's what that subject is. So we're not talking about the Qur'an's spiritual power, or like you could say, a believer could say, well, I believe the Old Testament is a miracle in my heart. Or a Hindu could say the Vedas have spiritual miracles performed on me. Yeah. We don't mean it in that spiritual sense. We actually mean it much more in an intellectual sense, in an academic sense. Muhammad didn't write the Qur'an because he didn't know how to write. Yeah. And it wasn't compiled in written form until after. And it was compiled to some extent in his lifetime on parchment, leather, rock, bones of animals, but the primary archiving of the Qur'an was memorization. The second thing, actually what you present as your fundamental intellectual problem, Qur'an having single source, right? Or the inspiration coming to one, and then on top of that it being literal, not inspired. Instead of being the inspired word of God, it's the literal word of God. These are actually the things that brought me to my conviction. Two-part answer. The first part is, if we see something miraculous at the hands of Moses, and we explain it away as the work of demons, it is possible. But actually by saying that that was the work of demons, what we're actually kind of acknowledging is that it was superhuman. That's not possible by a human being, okay? Now the question remains, there are two parts. One, to prove the miracle itself. What makes it miraculous? The fact that it's the literal word of God. We have to show that it's somehow, this language is superior to any human document, beyond a shadow of a doubt, to be able to say this can't be human work.
So let me ask that question. Why is the Quran then, in your mind, more superior than the Vedas or the Bhagavad Gita or the Bible or the Gospel or any other religious document?
All right. So like I said in my first introduction, I'm going to try to elaborate that point now. Islamic scholarship is concerned itself with the subject titled The Overpowering Miracle of the Qur'an for a millennium and a half. It has been studied from many, 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 many angles. In more recent history, you alluded to it, there's a discussion of scientific phenomenon in the Qur'an that could not have been known at the time and are only now coming to rehash and surface. For example, the moon not having light of its own, or two different kinds of water in the oceans, heavy water and light water, etc. These kinds of things that are alluded to in the Qur'an that are now only being discovered in science. But this is a recent discussion. This predates, you could argue, maybe the last 50, 70 years. But Muslims are holding on to their creed that the Qur'an is miraculous for a millennium and a half. That's a long time, without any scientific issues, right? The issue is this. In speech, we argue that speech is basically it comprises two components, style and content. And great speech is that which has meaningful content, but it's presented in marvelous style, right? What we're arguing in the linguistic study of Qur'an, and this is what's not easily translated into another language, is because it's the literal word of God, the way, not just what he says, but how he says it makes it miraculous. Now that's very difficult to explain to somebody who doesn't study Arabic, and this makes my job particularly difficult because I'm trying to say the Qur'an is miraculous in a linguistic sense. right? And so obviously the language that Muslims believe is Arabic. So much so that right now this rendition of the Qur'an, it's cover to cover English. It's a translation of the Qur'an. The title says Qur'an. No Muslim will ever call this Qur'an. The Qur'an is a message to the Muslims, a message for humanity, and it's a miracle. The message has to be translated in every language, and it actually started happening even in the life of the Prophet himself. But just to give you a taste of what I'm talking about. When I first got into this subject, as I was being raised as a Muslim, I was kind of a skeptic myself. And I heard over and over again that the Qur'an is an incredible language, unsurpassed language. It's the marvel of literature. And in high school in this country, I just became curious. I started reading the Qur'an for myself. And I found actually that it was confusing literature. It was moving from subject to subject, tenses were changing, context was changing, surahs were changing in their historical context. There was a lot of shift. And I didn't understand, because coming from a Western point of view, you have a certain view of how you critique literature, right? Now, when I got into Arabic studies, and I started diving into this question of what makes the Qur'an miraculous, I started discovering things that literally they overpowered me. And I'm still a student of them. I actually teach a seminar that's traveling the country called Divine Speech. And the entire intent of the seminar is to expose the literary marvel of the Qur'an to an English-speaking audience without resorting to Arabic. That's the seminar. Now, just one example. The Qur'an, Muslims believe, is a spoken word, it's not written. We also believe that Muhammad ﷺ didn't have the ability to write. We also know that when he would recite the Qur'an, there would be dozens of followers and they would immediately memorize what he said, and it would just spread. So there's no editorial process. You can't go back on what you recited. It's gone, it's out there now. You can't take it back. It's kind of like sending an email nowadays, right? Now, just as an example, one phrase in the Qur'an that's part of a large discussion is the phrase وَرَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ, and declare the greatness only of your Lord. Now recall I said something about a fusion of style and content. The content is beautiful, and it's part of a passage in which the signs of the Lord have been mentioned, the struggle has been mentioned, and then the messenger is being told, declare the greatness only of your Lord. What's interesting is the phrase وَرَبَّكَ فَكَبِّرْ is a palindrome. In other words, it spells backwards and forwards the same way. So the Qur'an is declaring the greatness of the Lord in a way, in its spelling form, and this is multiple instances in the spoken Qur'an, that it's actually a linguistic palindrome. Now, when you want to generate a palindrome in English, like race car, or Bob, or dad, or something like that, small one-syllable ones are easy to generate. Maybe a big word is a little harder, but a sentence, it would take you some time to sit down with words that are spelled backwards and forwards and come up with something that, and then even if you do that, your concern isn't your content. What's your concern? The spelling. So the spelling is actually dictating your content. Here you have multiple instances in the Qur'an where the content hasn't been altered. The content is continued, it flows with the passage, and yet the spelling structure is, it's a palindrome. It's symmetrical backwards and forwards the same way. And this is not one, these are multiple instances in the Qur'an. And this is one area of the many areas of the linguistic marvel of the Qur'an. The only other thing I want to comment that's easily understandable, actually two things. One, from a historical point of view. In the 1600s, I believe this was a professor of the Catholic Church, had written a paper about the great error in the Qur'an, the great historical error in the Qur'an. And that refers to, the Pharaoh and Moses. Well, Pharaoh in the Qur'an tells one of his ministers, whose name is Haman, okay, he tells him to build him a tower so he may reach the God of Moses and, to discuss with him. Now, this occurs about 4 or 5 times in the Qur'an. Haman is mentioned a total of 6 times in the Qur'an. When Christian and Jewish scholarship came into contact with this passage, the criticism was, first of all, there's no Haman mentioned in the Bible in association with the Pharaoh. Second of all, he has been mentioned in the book of Esther under the king Xerxes in the story of the Tower of Babylon. The Tower of Babel, the famous story. And this is 1,000 years after Moses. So it's a completely different historical era where Haman, and that man Haman has been mentioned as building a tower. So the obvious alleged error was that Muhammad, ma'adallah, may have confused these stories that he was kind of getting from the Christians and Jews and kind of mixed them together and presented this. Maurice Bucquois, it's about 70 years ago that he engaged in this study. He said, well, Jewish history contradicts what the Qur'an is saying about Haman and this tower building. Let's look at Egyptology. let's look at Egyptian history. So he travels to speak to some of these Egyptologists, says to them the Qur'an has this name, Haman, as a minister working for the historical pharaoh at the time of Moses. Egyptologists tell him, and this is actually articulated in his book, The Bible, Qur'an, and Science, that there's no way this man could have known that name, and it's not even going to be there because that language, the Egyptian hieroglyphic language, was already dead for a couple of thousand years. Nobody knew that language. After translation, he goes to Austria and finds out there's actually a list of people that worked in the court of Pharaoh. They find Haman as the chief architect. That's actually found in Egyptology, a name mentioned in the Qur'an. So from the historical point of view, last comment on this issue of the miraculous nature of the Qur'an claims, Inna nahnu nazzalna dhikr. We are the ones who have revealed the ultimate reminder.
We meaning?
God himself. He speaks of himself in the royal. Okay. And he says we've made the Qur'an easy for remembrance. To this day, the only book that, to my knowledge, that is memorized by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people of all ages, despite their language background, by the letter, from one end of the book to the other, is the Qur'an without photographic memory.